My name is Eric Thompson. I'm the Director of the Bureau of Business Research, and with me I have Rocky Weber, who is the President and General Counsel of the Nebraska Cooperatives Council. In a moment, Rocky's going to say a few words, and then we're going to go ahead and give you a PowerPoint presentation, giving you a little bit of information about the main points of our economic impact study on Nebraska's agricultural cooperatives. Just a few things to point out before we get started. We will have 2 poll questions, which you'll have an opportunity to participate in during the webinar. In fact, those will appear in sort of the upper middle screen. In fact, you can see the first question is currently up there. Please respond to those, and we'll talk about some of the answers we get from our webinar participants. There'll also be a chat room which you can participate in, chatting with any of the other members who are of our webinar audience. The chat window is located in the middle right of the screen, so please participate in that as you have an opportunity. And there's also going to be an opportunity to ask questions of me and of Rocky. Please type in your questions in the question and answer window, and then we'll go ahead and answer those at the end. So we'll go ahead and get started. As I mentioned, Rocky's going to say a few words, and then I'll go ahead and start with the presentation, and Rocky may chime in a few times during that as well. So go ahead, Rocky.
Thank you, Eric. You know, I think one of the questions that might come up is why would the Nebraska Cooperative Council commission an economic study on the role of the Nebraska farmer-owned cooperatives on the economy of Nebraska? You know, in the last 2 decades, we've seen a big change in the number of cooperatives in the state of Nebraska. This is not unusual just in Nebraska, but this is kind of a nationwide phenomenon. 2 decades ago, we had a little over 200 local cooperatives in the state of Nebraska. Today, we have 31 local cooperatives in the state of Nebraska. But the interesting thing about that, Eric, is that we have locations in 376 communities yet in the state of Nebraska. What caused this consolidation? Why has this occurred? Demographics, for one thing. The loss of population in the rural areas, fewer farmers, certainly has had a big role in that. Transportation logistics, starting with railroad policy and in the movement of grain and incentives to use 110-car shuttle loaders, and so have to build bigger facilities to move grain out on a quicker basis. And we've also seen technology, and as farmers have gotten fewer, they're farming more land, and so they have to plant, fertilize, and apply their chemicals in a quicker period, and they also have to move their harvest off the farm in a more consolidated fashion as well. And so these farmer-owned entities have had to respond to that by having enough economic leverage to build the speed and space and provide the goods and services that their farmer members require. So that's really what has been going on. And so after all this has happened, I think our board of directors wanted to see just what the economic impact is of Nebraska's farmer-owned cooperatives.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rocky. It's very interesting. I think it'll be very helpful to us as we review some of the results of the study as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started here, and just briefly go through our PowerPoint. Here's the outline. As you can see, the first poll question is open, so we're waiting to get everyone's response in. We're going to do a brief overview of Nebraska cooperatives, touching again on some of the issues that Rocky had mentioned. And then we're going to talk about our research results in terms of the value of cooperative activities, and then move on to discuss the economic impact of Nebraska's agricultural cooperatives. So let's go ahead and get started with that. The first thing we're presenting here is some time series information about cooperatives in the U.S. We have both marketing and supply cooperatives, and generally what you see is while there's been an increase in business volume, there's been some consolidation going on. So as you can see, it's a thriving, growing industry, but some of the phenomenon that Rocky discussed also going on as well. So our first poll question is, would we expect to see something similar in Nebraska? And about 80% of you felt that we would see consolidation in Nebraska as well following this national phenomenon. There's some evidence of that. Between the 2007 and 2013 period, a modest decline in the number of cooperatives, but I think equally as importantly, perhaps more importantly, there's been a strong increase in gross business volume in the sales of the cooperatives. So I think this shows the health and the strength of cooperatives, whether you talk about marketing or supply cooperatives. Another, I think, interesting point about Nebraska's cooperative sector is how many of them are major players or large cooperatives from a national perspective. So what you see in this table here is that 7 of the 50 largest cooperatives in the United States are actually located here in Nebraska, and you can see the names of those and some of their statistics and characteristics. So this is a highly successful sector from a national perspective here in Nebraska. Another way to look at that information, and this really gets to the reach and number of locations of Nebraska cooperatives that Rocky was discussing earlier. This map shows that reach and shows that the cooperatives are very active throughout the agricultural regions of our state, and also are leaders in the whole Midwestern cooperative sector with locations in the neighboring states as well. So what we tried to do with these slides is to really show the scope and the breadth of Nebraska's cooperative sector. So moving next to our research on the value that's produced for the Nebraska economy by the Nebraska agricultural cooperatives. Just wanted to real quickly have a slide to show you our methodological approach. We had 2 basic methodological approaches. I'll actually mention the second one first. Because we were doing this project with the Nebraska Cooperative Council, we had some great administrative data from membership forms that provided some detailed information about employment and activity at Nebraska's cooperatives, and that was really critical to assembling the data we needed for our study. We also did a follow-up survey of the members to gather a little bit more detailed information about the nature of investments that were made each year, about the sales and different product lines. This information was really critical for our economic impact study, and we're so grateful for the cooperative members. There's a very high participation rate in our survey, and it wasn't certainly a significant effort by the members to gather some of this additional information, and it really helped us produce a strong study. Well, let me go through some of the things we found. I want to mention that throughout the analysis, we tried to focus on a 3-year annual average, so to come up with a typical annual impact of Nebraska's agricultural cooperatives, averaging activity over a 3-year period, 2012-13 through 2014-15, averaging over a 3-year period that was representative of the different types of years you might have in Nebraska agriculture. So there's one year in there where grain prices were quite high, other years where grain prices were more moderate, and we were really glad that we could kind of look at an average that incorporated all those different types of scenarios. So you can see the results here. Total sales from the operations of Nebraska and regional cooperatives in the strongest year almost approaching $10 billion. Obviously the quantity of final sales does tail off a little bit as the price of Nebraska's grains tails off a little bit during this period. This pie chart shows sales by product line. So as you can see, grain marketing is the largest share of sales, but there's many other important components of sales on the supply side, such as sales of fertilizer, petroleum, chemicals. Also on the pie chart are some service categories such as transport services, other services, even some manufacturing activity that occurs at the cooperative. So a very broad set of services provided by Nebraska's agricultural cooperatives. Okay, let's look at it from the perspective of the labor market, of the jobs that are located at Nebraska's agricultural cooperatives. In all 3 years, there were right around or over 5,000 full-time jobs offered at these cooperatives. And of course, many of these jobs were located in rural Nebraska, where employment opportunities are always needed, so that's a big positive for our state's economy. There are also some part-time and seasonal employment opportunities as well. On the right-hand side, you have the payroll associated with this employment. So these are, on average, pretty well-paying jobs, generating, when you include benefits, as much as $330 million in annual wages and benefits for those workers. So again, a lot of that earning opportunity is located in rural Nebraska, creating a big benefit for our rural economy. Another thing we really wanted to focus on, in addition to the ongoing operations and sales and ongoing activities of Nebraska's agricultural cooperatives, is the investments that those cooperatives make in our states, in themselves, and therefore our state's economy every year. And so you can see here the results, detailed information about the investments of Nebraska's agricultural cooperatives during that 3-year period. And we split out investments in new equipment as well as investments in new buildings and facilities. And you can see that those investments, each type, approached $100 million. In fact, in the peak year, 2014-2015, both $130 million in investments in new equipment and $130 million in investments in new facilities. So that level of investment also generates a pretty substantial economic impact, and we'll talk about that a bit later.
And Eric, if I could just jump in there real quick, that's one of the things I think that comes from the unique nature of a farmer-owned cooperative. The board of directors that makes those decisions about strategy and where to put investments in new facilities or new equipment, they're all the farmers that own the cooperative, and they're elected by their farmer neighbors. And so one of the things they're looking at is how can we best provide the services that our owners need and maintain our value to our owners. And so I think that number is very significant in terms of what you were able to come up with, nearly $100 million a year over that 3-year period.
Obviously, Nebraska's agricultural cooperatives make contributions to our state in other ways. So there's a direct property and income tax payment of around $20 million per year. You'll see later that we calculate the total property tax impact when we calculate the total economic impact. Those impacts are even larger, but just the direct payments are nearly $20 million per year. A last contribution to the state economy from agricultural cooperatives is patronage allocations that are made to members each year, as well as equity and estate redemptions. And those also can add up to about $100 million a year back into Nebraska's economy.
And again, Eric, that's one of the ways that farmer-owned cooperatives are unique. You know, they put those dollars back into the hands of their patrons based upon the amount of business done by that patron. And those dollars typically are spent again in that local economy, and that multiplier effect takes place in a lot of places in that rural economy. And unlike other companies that do not have local ownership and broad local ownership like the farmer cooperatives have, you would not see necessarily that same economic impact occurring right there in that rural economy where those cooperatives are located.
That's right. And in a moment we'll discuss the economic impact estimates. You'll be able to see some of those multiplier impacts in the local economies. Well, now it's time for our second poll question. So speaking of the economic impact of Nebraska cooperatives, this question asks, where does the economic impact of Nebraska cooperatives occur? Of course, some of it will occur in rural Nebraska, but will there be also an impact in metropolitan Nebraska? So as we proceed with the webinar, please go ahead and chime in your opinion on that question. So let's go ahead and talk about economic impact. Now, whenever you do an economic impact study, there's typically two components. There's the direct economic activity. We've been talking about that for Nebraska's agricultural cooperatives in terms of sales, employment, patronage allocations, property tax payments, payroll, and the like. So this table here kind of summarizes those direct economic impacts. And what we can see on a 3-year average is the direct economic impact is $1.33 billion. So $1.33 billion onto the Nebraska economy just from the activity at the cooperatives themselves. As part of that $1.33 billion, there's $450 million worth of wages and benefits, or those allocations back to members that we discussed earlier. You can see that in the second part of the graph and at the table. And at the bottom of the table, then you see the employment impact. So if you include the direct employment at the cooperatives, the employment associated with those investments, building new facilities, the workers involved in that, you can see the employment impact is nearly 7,200 jobs a year. That's just the direct economic impact. Now, in addition to a direct economic impact, there's also what's known as a multiplier impact, the additional impacts on the economy. To get an intuition about what that means, think about those 7,200 workers employed due to the cooperatives. They're going to spend their paychecks, just like we all do, on at businesses of every kind, for rent or mortgage, at restaurants, at retail stores, and so forth. And so that creates sales and employment opportunities at a whole group of additional businesses. Besides employees, the cooperatives themselves are going to have suppliers and service providers. And there's going to be a lot of additional earnings and employment opportunities at those businesses. So those two things together are what create that multiplier impact. How large is that multiplier impact? Well, it's not quite as large as the direct impact, but it's pretty substantial. So you can see here that the multiplier impact, just the additional economic activity in business sales, is nearly $900 million per year. With that sales, associated with that sales, there's about $300 million in labor income and nearly 7,000 additional Nebraska jobs. So if you put it all together and look at the total economic impact, the direct impact and the multiplier impact, you can see it's nearly 14,000 Nebraska jobs, $750 million in wages, salaries, and member payments, and $2.2 billion in total economic activity on Nebraska's economy. Obviously, that amount of economic activity is also going to generate some tax revenue for state and local government, and we have an estimate of that as well. So the overall tax impact, including the multiplier impacts, is more like $120 million per year, according to our 3-year average. So those are the statewide economic impacts. Obviously, a significant part of that impact will happen in rural Nebraska, but I think an important point to make is that the impacts occur throughout the state economy. So that leads us back to our poll question. Where does the economic impact of Nebraska's agricultural cooperatives occur? I see that nearly everyone put that the impact occurs both in rural and metropolitan Nebraska, and that's certainly the case. While most cooperatives are located in rural areas, those large multiplier impacts occur all over the state, including in Omaha and Lincoln, our state's 2 largest metropolitan areas. We have a quick graph about that we'd like to show you. So here on this table, you can see those same statewide multiplier impacts in the 3rd column presented again. But then we show you what portion of those impacts occur in Omaha and Lincoln. And depending on the measure, you see that 10 to 15% of the multiplier impact occurs in our 2 largest cities. So because of the operations and investments of Nebraska's Nebraska's ag cooperatives, there's a $130 million annual economic impact on the Omaha and Lincoln economies put together. There's nearly $50 million in labor income in the Omaha and Lincoln economies. There's 740 jobs present in the Lincoln and Omaha economies. So it just makes the point that our whole state benefits from the success of this sector. Well, those were the main points we wanted to make. Here's a little information on where you can follow some results from the Bureau of Business Research, whether LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter, and we encourage you to follow us on social media. And I just want to thank everyone who participated in making this report possible. Obviously, Rocky Weber co-hosting the webinar with me. I want to thank Mitch Harrion and Dave Rosenbaum for their contributions as co-authors of the research, and of course our College of Business Administration ITS team for hosting the event in their new multimedia room. So at this point, we'd like to answer any questions that have come in during the course of the webinar, or feel free to turn in a question right now as we continue to talk. So here's the first question. How does my co-op determine daily commodity prices?
Well, generally speaking, the co-ops determine daily commodity prices just like any other company that buys grain. You have a futures market component, you have a local basis component, you have a transportation component, and supply and demand drives a lot of that, Eric. You know, what can the cooperative turn around, or any grain company turn around and sell that grain for on a back-to-back sale, or if it's got to hold the grain in store for a while, how does it have to hedge that and make sure that it can maintain the price it's got in that? And so, you know, supply and demand, and that's clearly the case. We have today low commodity prices because there's so much supply right now. And so cooperatives don't do that any differently than any other grain purchaser.
Okay. Oh, we had a follow-up question. Are co-ops competitive with independent fertilizer dealers?
I would say yes, from my knowledge.
Well, and I think the fact that you see cooperatives competing in that area is evidence of that competitiveness. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions at this time. So again, I want to thank everyone who's participated in the webinar. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you here for about a half hour today. Please, review the report, which will be available at the website of the Nebraska Cooperative Council, as well as the Bureau of Business Research. And we hope you'll have time to participate in future webinars of the Bureau, including one upcoming in May. So thank you again.